Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are undertaking, well, a truly monumental task, I think. We're plumbing the depths of a piece of research titled Revisited, The River Through General World Theory.
Yeah, and this isn't just about, updating some old ideas.
No, exactly. This deep dive is really about fundamentally challenging how we even see some of the most vital features on our planet. I mean, forget the simple blue lines on a map you learned back in school.
Right.
We are analyzing rivers not just as geographical features, but as the actual circulatory systems of entire regions central to human civilization, culture, economy, and, increasingly to global conflict, too.
That's the absolutely crucial shift in perspective the source material is pushing for. Rivers are foundational. They're not just ancillary features.
Foundational, like the Nile.
Exactly. The Nile, for instance, it didn't merely flow through the landscape where Egyptian civilization happened to pop up. The river's predictable annual rhythm, that flooding and silt deposition, it actually birthed that entire civilization. And think about the Amazon. It doesn't just happen to contain, 10% of global biodiversity. It acts as a massive atmospheric anchor for global climate systems. They're truly intrinsic to our survival.
And the reason we need this kind of rigorous analysis now is because over the past century or so, our relationship with these systems went through this study calls it a traumatic shift.
It really was.
The sources detail how we move from what was once an intimate, embodied knowledge and adaptive coexistence, where societies lived with the river, part of its flow, to a world that's now defined by technological mediation, legal allocation, and engineered control. We basically prioritize immediate economic gains, often through attempting total control.
And the result, cascading ecological crises. We see it everywhere.
Which means that transformation, it requires us to move way beyond just, single disciplinary expertise.
Oh, absolutely. You can't solve the crisis in the Colorado River with only hydrology, for example. It doesn't work. You need to understand the 1922 legal compact, the indigenous history of the basin, the intense economic demands, the political boundaries, all of it. Rivers, as the study argues, are transdisciplinary phenomena par excellence.
Par excellence. Okay. So they demand this really holistic comprehension.
They really do.
The study gives us this brilliant metaphor for that necessary holistic approach.
Yeah.
The river as living archive, like it's a history book, a political ledger, all written in water and stone.
Precisely. Rivers are palimpsests, like those ancient parchments.
Where they scraped off the old text and wrote over it.
Exactly. But the faint traces of the original writing, they still influence what you see today, how the new text lies on the page. The river is just like that. The traces of the past ancient riverbeds, old policies, cultural traumas, they remain, and they profoundly constrain our present actions.
You see that constraint everywhere, don't you?
Yeah.
I mean, the Colorado River's current state of, near collapse, it isn't just the result of last week's drought or even last year's.
No, not at all.
It's rooted deep in the 1922 Compact. That's a century-old policy decision based on what turned out to be a wildly optimistic overestimation of flow.
Based on unusually wet years just before they signed it.
Right. And that flawed assumption still legally dictates water allocation today. That's constraint written in law, not in nature.
Or look at the Mississippi Delta. It's literally collapsing into the Gulf of Mexico. That isn't just natural erosion happening faster.
No.
It reflects the cumulative consequences of 20th century dam construction, the levees they built up and down the river.
All the engineering.
All the engineering. It severed the river from its natural flood patterns, stopped the sediment from reaching the delta. The river's history, its natural rhythm, was effectively erased, or at least suppressed. And now the consequences are written in catastrophic land loss.
It's fascinating how the study approaches this. The methodology contrasts two kinds of data sets, right?
Yeah, it's quite unique. On the one hand, you have historical exploration narratives, often from the 17th, 18th, 19th, up to the 20th centuries. Think explorers' journals, early maps, that kind of thing.
Okay.
And on the other hand, you have contemporary scientific and policy sources, 21st century data, climate models, legal documents, international agreements.
And comparing those two highlights our core failing. Is that the idea?
That's exactly it. We moved from the state of immersed participation societies literally lived in the river's rhythm to what they call mediated management. Now we exist beside the river, trying to control it from a distance with satellites, complex legal compacts, massive infrastructure.
So it's a shift from, say, localized adaptation, like you mentioned, indigenous Amazonian communities, knowing exactly when and where to plant based on generations of intimate knowledge about silt deposition.
Yeah, that deep embodied understanding.
This idea of systemic control, where massive dams tried to eliminate natural variability entirely.
And ironically, often created catastrophic instability down the line, the very thing they were trying to prevent.
Okay, so to organize this huge scope, we're talking history, policy, science, culture. The study uses something called general world theory, or GWT. Now, that sounds pretty academic.
It does, yeah.
Can you ground that for us? What is GWT, basically, and how does a river physically embody it?
Well, basically, GWT is a framework that defines reality, the world, as being inherently dynamic, relational, and plural. It's saying things aren't static, they're interconnected, and they hold multiple meanings at once.
Okay, dynamic, relational, plural.
And the authors argue that this framework isn't just some arbitrary academic model they're imposing onto rivers. They argue its 9 dimensions actually describe the fundamental ontological characteristics of rivers themselves.
So the river is the theory, in a way.
In a very real sense, yes. Think about it. A river is never static, right? It's always changing its flow, its course, sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically. That's dynamic, or what GWT calls becoming.
Makes sense.
It's always connected to its watershed, the groundwater, the atmosphere, the communities along its banks, the fish, the plants. That's relational or interdependence. And a river is never just one thing. It's a source of drinking water, and a pathway for commerce, and a sacred site, and a political boundary, and a habitat. That's plural. So the river doesn't just fit the theory. You could say the river teaches the theory through its very existence.
Wow, that really reframes our mission for this deep dive for you, the listener. We're essentially using the river's own lessons, as described in this study, as our lens. We'll walk through the 9 dimensions of GWT, guided by the study's central question.
Which is a powerful one.
It is. From the viewpoint of the river itself, how can humanity understand and participate in the world as a dynamic, relational, and plural reality? So let's jump into that first cluster of dimensions. It focuses on flow, connection, and change. Okay, part 1 is called the relational flow. This covers the first 3 GWT dimensions: interdependence, pluralism, and becoming. These really deal with the river as a dynamic, interconnected system, constantly in flux. Let's start with interdependence. The core idea here is that everything, all beings, systems, even truths, are interconnected and they kind of co-arise.
Exactly. And historically, looking through those older narratives, this interdependence wasn't abstract. It was immediate. It was visceral. Often, it was a matter of localized existential survival.
Like your Nile example earlier.
The Nile is the absolute textbook case. Its annual inundation, the flood, deposited that incredibly rich, fertile silt. That wasn't just nice. It was absolutely vital for Egyptian agriculture. Life depended on it.
And that relationship was so fundamental.
So fundamental that the main technology they used to manage it, the shad, that counterbalance lever with a bucket to lift water.
Yeah, I've seen pictures. Simple but effective.
Incredibly effective because it was simple and worked with the natural flood cycle, didn't try to fight it. And get this, that basic technology remained virtually unchanged for millennia. Millennia.
Yeah.
Because it respected the interdependence. When the flood failed or was too low, it wasn't just an inconvenience. Water scarcity meant immediate crisis, famine, social collapse. The dependency was absolute and undeniable. You felt it.
You literally felt the river's state in your gut every single year. Okay, but what happens when we shift to the contemporary view, using the modern sources? That very direct, localized dependency seems to disappear for many people, replaced by this huge systemic global complexity.
The scale becomes almost unrecognizable. We move from, say, a few villages being totally dependent on a predictable local flood to potentially millions, even billions of people relying on vast, incredibly complex hydrological basins. Basins that we now know influence global systems.
Like the Amazon again?
Right. We know the Amazon basin doesn't just house 10% of the world's known biodiversity. It's flying rivers, these massive streams of atmospheric water vapor generated by the forest influence rainfall patterns across South America and potentially much further afield. The interdependence is there, but it's operating at this planetary scale.
But does that complexity mean the crises are also different?
Yes. The cascading crises become brutal, often delayed, and geographically dispersed. The cause and effect are harder to see immediately, unlike the Nile flood failing.
And the sources give some pretty stark data on this delayed, scaled-up impact, right?
They do. Take the Zambezi River in southern Africa. The construction of large dams upstream, mainly for hydropower, Well, it drastically reduced the flow of fresh water and, crucially, sediment downstream to the delta.
And the impact.
Catastrophic for the coastal ecosystem. Mangrove coverage was reduced by a staggering 40%. The prawn catches, a vital local fishery, crashed by 60%. Why? Because the dams essentially starved the delta and the near-shore environment of the silt and nutrients they depended on. The interdependence was broken thousands of kilometers away from the dams themselves.
And we see similar things closer to home, like the Mississippi.
The Mississippi is a perfect, tragic example in the U.S. You have agricultural runoff fertilizers, pesticides from farm fields in places like Iowa, Minnesota, Illinois.
Way up in the Midwest.
Exactly. That runoff gets carried by the river system, this interconnected network of streams and rivers, all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. And it acts as the primary contributor to that massive hypoxic zone, the dead zone,
where the excess nutrients cause algal blooms that suck all the oxygen out of the water,
killing off marine life over huge areas. That's systemic vulnerability. Actions taken for local benefit maximizing crop yield in Iowa have devastating consequences far away, mediated by the river system. It's interdependence playing out on a continental scale, with global implications for fisheries and ocean health.
Okay, so here's the paradox that the study really forces us to grapple with, the comparative insight. We've shifted from that immediate, localized survival dependency to this complex systemic vulnerability. And at the same time, our scientific awareness has exploded. We can model the nutrient flow from an Iowa farm right down to the Gulf. We know about the interdependence in incredible detail.
More detail than ever before.
Yet this expanded knowledge hasn't stopped us. In fact, it seems like it's almost enabled us to cause far more severe, widespread disruptions than historical societies ever did with their simpler technologies. Why? If we understand the interdependence so well now, why do we keep triggering these catastrophes?
That's the absolute crux of the issue, isn't it? And the study suggests quite powerfully that it's fundamentally not a failure of knowledge per se. We have the knowledge.
So what is it?
It's a failure of relationship, yes, but also a failure of our institutional structures. Our dominant political and economic systems are largely designed to maximize local, short-term benefits. Think the immediate hydropower generated by the dam, or the increased yield from that heavily fertilized field.
And the costs.
The costs, the downstream ecological collapse, the dead zone in the Gulf, the long-term instability, those are externalized. They're pushed onto the global system, onto downstream communities, often marginalized ones, or onto future generations. Interdependence is scientifically recognized, maybe even celebrated in textbooks.
But not built into the rules of the game.
Exactly. It's not economically or legally internalized in a meaningful way. So, we know better intellectually, but our systems are often institutionally designed, or at least incentivized, to make us act worse. We fail to act as if we are truly interdependent. And that deep realization of interconnectedness, of interdependence, leads us very naturally into the second dimension.
Pluralism. Pluralism. Okay, so this is the idea that rivers inherently hold multiple, often competing meanings and values simultaneously.
Precisely. A river is never just one single thing. It is, at the very same time, a hydrological system carrying water and sediment and potentially a sacred entity or ancestor, and an economic highway for transport, and a political boundary between states or nations, and a source of aesthetic beauty and a critical habitat.
All at once.
All at once. And these meanings aren't always compatible.
Looking back historically, how did this pluralism play out? The sources mention contested meanings, managed through power, or maybe just geographical separation.
Yeah, you saw constant tension, often between, say, indigenous spiritual worldviews and encroaching commercial or colonial interests. In the American Southwest, for instance, the study highlights the Navajo. They didn't just see rivers as water sources. They embedded profound spiritual meaning directly into the landscape's hydrology.
You mentioned male and female water.
Exactly. They called the turbulent, powerful San Juan River the male water, Tobaca, and the more placid, life-giving Rio Grande the female water, Tabad. This wasn't just poetry. It embodied gender, spiritual identity, and guidance for how to interact with those specific rivers right into the flow itself.
Wow.
Meanwhile, elsewhere, you had geopolitical battles transforming rivers into strategic resources. Think about the Amazon again. When Brazil, in the colonial and early independence periods, sought a monopoly over navigation, viewing it primarily as an exclusive commercial artery for its own benefit.
Other nations pushed back.
Absolutely. Rival nations upstream, like Bolivia and Ecuador, whose access to the Atlantic depended on those tributaries, declared them free and open to the commerce of the world. The river became a stage for very explicit international economic and political conflict, completely different from the Navajo spiritual view.
Okay, so fast forward to the contemporary view. Are these conflicts still happening? The study suggests they're still acute, but maybe they've become more formalized,
Yep.
codified in law.
That's a good way to put it. The conflicts are absolutely still there, often sharper than ever, but now they tend to be fought out within legal frameworks, policy debates, and scientific assessments. This leads to incredibly complex, often seemingly irreconcilable tensions.
And the prime example seems to be the Ganges.
The Ganges River, or Ganga in India, is perhaps the most potent contemporary example of this intractable pluralism. For hundreds of millions of Hindus, the Ganges isn't just a river, she is the goddess Ganga, descended to earth. There's a deeply held spiritual belief that her waters are inherently pure, capable of washing away sins, and can never truly become polluted in a spiritual sense.
That's a powerful belief.
Immensely powerful, and it's a completely valid truth within that religious and cultural worldview, shaping rituals, pilgrimages, life and death.
But then you have the science.
Then you have the scientific measurements. Fecal coliform bacteria levels from untreated sewage and industrial waste are often measured at thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands, of times above the permissible standards for safe bathing, let alone drinking. The river is simultaneously understood as spiritually pure and measured as dangerously materially polluted.
Wait a minute. How on earth do you manage a river when you have two such profound competing truths that essentially negate each other? One says pure, the other says highly polluted.
You often end up in an intractable stalemate, which is largely what we see with the Ganges. Attempts at purely scientific or engineering solutions like building more sewage treatment plants, which are desperately needed, can run directly into resistance rooted in the belief system.
How so?
Well, if the water is inherently pure, why treat it like waste? Some may see efforts to clean Ganga as disrespectful or unnecessary from a spiritual standpoint. Conversely, ignoring the pollution has led to a massive public health crisis. The study notes estimates that up to 80% of health problems in India are linked to waterborne diseases. It's a catastrophic real-world consequence of this clash of truths, where honoring one truth seems to require violating the other.
That's incredibly challenging. But the sources also show that sometimes, maybe, this pluralism can be formally recognized in law. The example from New Zealand.
Yes, the Whanganui River in New Zealand. This is seen globally as a groundbreaking case. In 2017, the river was granted legal personhood. This wasn't just a symbolic gesture.
What did it mean legally?
It meant the law now recognizes the river itself as a legal entity, with rights and interests. Crucially, this framework incorporates the Maori spiritual relationship with the river, known as Te Awa Tupua.
Which means
Literally something like the river of sacred power, or the ancestor that flows. It recognizes the river as a living whole, an indivisible entity encompassing its physical and metaphysical elements, reflecting the Maori worldview within the country's legal system. It appointed guardians, one from the Crown and one from the Wanganui Iwi tribe, to act on the river's behalf.
So that's an example of legal innovation driven by accepting pluralism, by trying to bridge different worldviews.
Exactly. Now contrast that radically with the Colorado River. Its governance is almost entirely locked into the law of the river.
Which we mentioned earlier, the 1922 Compact and subsequent laws.
Right. And that legal framework is strictly allocative. It conceptualizes the water almost purely as a quantifiable resource to be divided up among states and users according to prior appropriation doctrines, first in time, first in right.
So there's little room for other values.
Very little formal institutional space for its ecological health as a system, or its sacred status to the numerous indigenous tribes in the basin whose connections long predate the compact. Those values exist, people fight for them, but they struggle to gain legal traction against the dominant allocative framework.
This comparative insight here seems really profound then. We've moved from a kind of implicit pluralism, where different meanings might have existed somewhat separately in space or time, to an explicit, often conflict-ridden pluralism that's now codified in our laws and institutions.
And the challenge, the study argues, is immense. Can we design institutional structures, like the Wanganui example attempts, that can actually hold and negotiate between two or more potentially irreconcilable worldviews? Can a river be both a sacred ancestor and a managed resource pool within the same governance system?
Because the future health of these rivers, and maybe our societies, depends on finding ways to navigate that tension, rather than letting one view completely dominate and erase the others.
That seems to be the core message. It's about managing the intersections, the conflicts that arise from pluralism.
That discussion of managing competing truths and values sets the stage really well for the third dimension in this cluster. Becoming. This is the GWT principle that the world and rivers within it are not static things, but are constantly unfolding, transforming, evolving.
Right. Rivers are inherently dynamic. They change their course over time. Their flow varies dramatically season to season, year to year, century to century. Their composition, the sediment load, the water chemistry is always in flux. Becoming is their natural state.
Historically, how was this sense of becoming perceived? The study suggests change was often seen on these immense, almost geological timescales.
Yes, certainly the very long-term changes. People observe the evidence. You read about the Colorado River cutting its immense canyons over uncounted cycles, a recognition of deep time. Ancient records from Egypt, like those from the time of Pharaoh Amenemhat III around the 19th century BC, show Nile flood levels were dramatically higher, maybe 27 feet higher than even large modern floods. And they also recorded subsequent drainage catastrophes like potentially abrupt changes around 1703 BC that disrupted the established patterns. So there was an awareness of both gradual change and occasional dramatic shifts.
And human practices were more about adapting to survive within that cycle.
Exactly. Think back to the Shadoof. Why was it so successful for so long? Precisely because it was a low-tech, flexible tool that adapted to the Nile's annual cycle of flood and retreat. It didn't try to stop the flood or fundamentally alter the river's becoming. It worked with the dynamism.
Okay, so the historical view involved adaptation to natural variability, often over long timescales. But the contemporary view, according to the sources, is completely dominated by accelerated anthropogenic change. We're not talking geological time anymore. We're often talking decades or even years.
We're talking about the impact of the industrial era, especially the massive dam construction boom, roughly from 1910 to the 1970s, which reshaped almost every major river system on Earth. And layered on top of that now is rapid climate change. The sheer speed and scale of this human-driven change are outpacing the adaptive capacity of many river ecosystems.
The data points are pretty stark, aren't they?
They are. The Colorado River again. Scientific estimates suggest its flow was reduced by about 10% just between the years 2000 and 2021, primarily due to rising temperatures causing increased evaporation and reduced snowpack. That's a significant drop in available water in just 2 decades, driven by atmospheric changes, not just by people taking water out.
And the Amazon example from 2022.
That was terrifying. A severe drought exacerbated by deforestation and climate change caused water temperatures in parts of the Amazon basin to reach an astonishing 39.1 degrees Celsius.
That's over 102 degrees Fahrenheit.
In the river. And the immediate visible result was the death of at least 125 endangered Amazon river dolphins, basically cooked in their own habitat. The speed of that transition from a normal state to a lethal state is a hallmark of this accelerated anthropogenic becoming.
And what's truly ironic here, the study points out, is that many of our massive engineering efforts, the ones aimed at creating stability,
like building huge dams for reliable water supply and flood control or constructing extensive levee systems,
they've actually ended up creating instability at larger systemic scales. We traded perceived short-term security for accelerating long-term collapse.
It's a profound paradox of control.
Can you elaborate on that with the Mississippi? You mentioned the avulsion cycle earlier. The idea that trying to control the river actually leads to the delta collapsing is, I think, counterintuitive for a lot of people.
Absolutely. So an avulsion is the natural process where a large river carrying a lot of sediment, like the Mississippi, gradually builds up its own riverbed over centuries. It deposits sediment right there in the channel. Eventually, the riverbed gets so high relative to the surrounding floodplain that the river becomes unstable. During a large flood, it finds an easier, steeper path to the sea and suddenly jumps course, carving a whole new channel, sometimes hundreds of miles away from the old one.
And the Mississippi did this naturally.
Naturally, about every 1,000 years or so. This process is precisely how its vast delta was built and maintained over millennia. Each avulsion created a new lobe of the delta, spreading that vital sediment across the landscape, counteracting natural subsidence.
But we stopped it.
We stopped it. By building thousands of miles of levees to keep the river locked in its current channel, primarily to protect navigation in cities like New Orleans, and crucially, by constructing the old river control structure in Louisiana, which prevents the Mississippi from switching course towards the Atchafalaya River, the path it wants to take, we essentially block the river's natural avulsion cycle.
We thought we were securing the land, protecting our investments.
Exactly. We prioritize static predictability over natural dynamism. But by eliminating the river's essential, becoming its natural tendency to shift and transform and redistribute sediment, we inadvertently starved the existing delta.
Starved it of the sediment it needed.
The sediment it needed to counteract the natural sinking of the land and the effects of rising sea levels.
Right.
We stopped the very process that built and sustained the delta.
So trying to stop the river from being dynamic, trying to freeze it in place,
Accelerated the degradation and loss of the entire coastal ecosystem. Tens of square miles of wetlands disappear every year now. The transformation highlighted here is stark. From historical society successfully adapting to the river's natural, slower timescales of change, to contemporary society accelerating change beyond the environment's capacity to cope, often ironically through efforts aimed at stabilization. The river's variability, its becoming, was actually key to its long-term stability and resilience. Eliminating that dynamism effectively guaranteed eventual collapse at a larger scale. And that whole discussion of accelerated change, of becoming, and how we've tried to manage or suppress it, sets the perfect stage for part 2 of our deep dive, which focuses on knowledge and history. If things are changing this fast, how do we actually know what's going on? How do we acquire knowledge? And crucially, how much is our understanding and our ability to act constrained by the weight of the past?
Okay, so this cluster covers the next 4 GWT dimensions: relational knowing, entanglement, contextuality, and non-finality. Let's start with relational knowing. This sounds like the crucial idea that knowledge isn't just abstract data, but it emerges from specific contexts: local, indigenous, scientific, experiential. It's situated.
Precisely. Knowledge is always from somewhere and for something. The historical view, gleaned from those older sources, really emphasizes embodied expertise and knowledge transmitted orally, often across generations. This made it inherently holistic and deeply integrated into daily life and survival.
You mentioned Amazon River pilots earlier.
Yeah, think about them. Their knowledge wasn't learned from reading charts, not primarily anyway. It was this intimate moment-to-moment expertise of constantly shifting sandbars, submerged logs, changing currents. Knowledge absolutely essential for safely navigating those complex, dynamic jungle waterways. It was felt in the boat, read in the water's surface.
Embodied knowledge.
Exactly. Or consider the communities along the Atbara River, a tributary of the Nile in Sudan and Ethiopia. The sources mention their incredible, almost uncanny ability to discern the faint sound of an approaching flash flood coming down a dry riverbed long before it was visible.
Wow, hearing the flood come in.
Hearing it, feeling the vibrations maybe. That's a level of sensory awareness and deeply situated relational knowing that transcends anything you'd find in a hydrological report. It's knowledge born from living in that specific environment.
And the Navajo farmers.
A similar deep connection. Their knowledge wasn't just about what to plant, but precisely how and where. Knowing to plant corn deep enough to reach the subsoil moisture in an arid environment. And this knowledge wasn't just practical. It was embedded within thousands of ancient songs and stories about farming, passed down through generations, unifying hydrology, agriculture, spirituality, and cultural identity.
Okay, so that's the historical picture. Integrated, embodied relational knowledge. The contemporary view, in stark contrast, is characterized by technological mediation and intense specialization.
Right. Today we use incredibly sophisticated tools. Scientists use metagenomics to sequence the DNA of microbes in Amazonian freshwater to understand ecosystem health. We rely on GRACE satellites, gravity recovery, and climate experiment orbiting the Earth to estimate changes in groundwater storage and river runoff across entire continents by measuring tiny variations in gravity.
Amazing technology.
Amazing, yes. But the knowledge derived from it tends to be distributed across highly specialized, often quite isolated disciplinary silos. Hydrologists study flow, ecologists study species, economists model water markets, lawyers interpret water law.
And the problem is the fragmentation.
The fragmentation is often the critical issue. A hydrologist might possess perfect, quantifiable knowledge of river flow rates based on gauge data and models, but they might have absolutely zero understanding of the cultural history, the spiritual significance, or the past experiences that shape how a local community perceives a proposed water management project.
And this is where that historical archive, the palimpsest idea, starts to really interfere with contemporary management efforts.
Exactly. This circles right back to that devastating example you raised earlier concerning the Mississippi Delta communities and the legacy of the 1926 Bohemia spillway.
Right, the incident involving racially motivated forced relocation, supposedly for flood control, but the land was then effectively seized for oil and gas development.
That historical trauma, that betrayal, is now an integral part of the relational knowing of that community. It's knowledge passed down, remembered, felt. So today, scientists and engineers might arrive with what seem like technically sound, scientifically based projects for coastal restoration.
But the community reacts differently.
The community harbors what the sources describe as profound distrust. Why? Because they possess knowledge, experiential, relational, historical knowledge that tells them that previous interventions by outside experts and government agencies were deceptive and ultimately harmful to them. That memory, that knowledge, acts as a powerful constraint.
So the best scientific data in the world can be rendered useless.
It can be completely undermined if it fails to acknowledge and respectfully engage with that community's relational knowing, including the knowledge of past harms. The system fails not because the science is bad, but because the relationship is broken. The knowledge can't bridge the gap of distrust.
So the comparative insight here seems to be this shift from a naturally integrated, embodied knowledge, where things like navigation, ecology, spirituality were all just part of understanding the river, to our current state of fragmented, specialized epistemologies.
Where disciplines often struggle even to communicate effectively with each other, let alone with the communities they are meant to serve.
And the hard lesson is that even the most sophisticated, specialized knowledge can become functionally useless or even counterproductive if it can't build trust and cooperate with the people who actually live with the river. The whole system breaks down at that interface between the disembodied expert knowledge and the embodied community knowledge.
It's a crucial point about where knowledge gets its power and legitimacy. Which leads us nicely into the fifth dimension, entanglement. This builds directly on relational knowing. Entanglement is the core GWT idea that different domains of reality, the material, the mental, the social, the spiritual, are not actually separate things, but are inherently inseparable, interwoven.
So a river isn't just H2O flowing in a channel. It's simultaneously physical, social, spiritual, and economic, all tangled up together.
Exactly. You can't cleanly pull those threads apart without losing the reality of the river itself. Historically, this entanglement was often just the lived reality. These life worlds were fundamentally inseparable in people's experience.
Like the Nile again, the silt and the god happy.
Perfect example. The material reality of the Nile depositing its fertile silt annually was intrinsically, inextricably linked to the social reality of the Egyptian calendar. The 3 seasons of Aket, inundation, Peret, growth, and Shemu, harvest, were defined by the river's actions. And both were tied to the spiritual reality of the god Hapi, the personification of the flood who had to be appeased. You couldn't analyze the water flow without understanding the political and religious order that managed it, and vice versa.
It was all one system.
It was perceived and lived as one system. Similarly, in the Amazon, the study mentions how the material event of seasonal floods distributing nutrient-rich silt for agriculture was inseparable from cultural beliefs. For example, beliefs surrounding the Yakumama, the powerful water serpent or mother of the waters.
And these beliefs dictated behavior.
Yes, they dictated specific social behaviors, like the custom of making ritual noise before entering unfamiliar lakes or stretches of river to respectfully announce your presence to the spirit world. The physical necessity of farming and fishing was governed by and enacted through a spiritual understanding of the terrain and its non-human inhabitants. It was all entangled.
But today, our modern approach seems to be about disentangling everything. We are specialists in separation.
That's a very accurate way to describe the dominant contemporary approach driven by disciplinary specialization and reductionist science. We take the Colorado River, for instance. We analyze its physical property, its steep gradient, and utilize that very effectively to produce massive amounts of hydroelectricity, around 12 billion kilowatt hours yearly. That's a huge economic driver.
But managed separately.
Managed almost completely separately from its cultural roles for the various indigenous tribes in the basin, or its critical ecological function in sustaining riparian habitats, and historically, a vast delta ecosystem, which is now mostly gone. We analyze and manage these as separate variables, separate inputs and outputs in different models run by different agencies.
We disentangle them for analysis and management.
We try to. And again, the Ganges crisis serves as the perfect, painful illustration of the failure of this analytical separation. We attempt to address the material pollution crisis using scientific tools and engineering solutions.
Building treatment plants, setting pollution standards.
Right. But because this approach often ignores or even dismisses the deeply held spiritual belief that the water is inherently pure, the scientific solutions are systematically undermined or meet resistance. The attempt to separate the domains, the material from the mental spiritual, has created a disastrous systemic outcome where neither the pollution is solved nor the spiritual value fully honored in practice.
So the transformation here, the comparative insight, is from a kind of pre-analytic unity where the river was just naturally understood and experienced as a unified, entangled phenomenon to our current, often desperate and frequently failing attempts at systemic reintegration after we've already fragmented everything through our disciplines.
We performed the analytical separation believing it gave us clarity and control. Now we're realizing the consequences of that separation are catastrophic, precisely because the river itself never respected those conceptual dividing lines we drew. The entanglement was real all along.
And ignoring it has led us to crisis.
In many cases, yes. The challenge is how to think and act in ways that respect the entanglement again.
That failure to reintegrate or even acknowledge the entanglement leads directly into the sixth dimension, contextuality. This is the idea that meaning, action, and even physical reality are always shaped by their specific historical and geographical context. Rivers, the study argues, carry these histories, sediments of time that both constrain and enable what we can do now.
Exactly. Context isn't just background, it's embedded. Historically, this context, this history, was often physically visible and encoded directly in the river's environment. You could literally read the past in the landscape.
Like the Nile example.
Right. The study mentions the Nile's ancient higher riverbed near Aswan, which physically testifies to that massive drainage change or catastrophe hypothesized around 1703 BC. It's geological history written in stone. Or think about political history. Brazil's early attempts to monopolize Amazon navigation created lasting geopolitical tensions and distrust that shaped all subsequent exploration, boundary drawing, and international policy in the basin for centuries. The history became the context for future interaction.
Okay, so the past was often physically or politically visible. But the contemporary view, the study emphasizes, is often dominated by invisible histories that exert immense constraining power. Things like infrastructural path dependency and historical trauma.
Precisely. These aren't always things you can see just by looking at the river. They're embedded in our laws, our institutions, our infrastructure, and our collective memories. They are powerful constraints inherited from the past.
And the clearest example globally seems to be that 1922 Colorado River Compact again.
It's impossible to understand the current Colorado crisis without understanding the context of 1922. The negotiators, working with limited data from an unusually wet period, dramatically overestimated the river's long-term average flow. They allocated more water on paper than the river reliably provides.
And that mistake, made a century ago.
That specific historical error, embedded in the foundational legal document, the Compact, becomes the rigid baseline for almost all subsequent laws, treaties, and infrastructure built in the basin. It created an institutional path dependency. You cannot fundamentally renegotiate the Colorado crisis today without confronting and somehow overcoming that century-old mistake, that specific historical context that locks the entire system into perpetual conflict over scarcity.
The past literally dictates the present water shortage, legally speaking.
In a very real sense, yes. And we absolutely must revisit the Mississippi Delta here because it illustrates the social dimension of contextuality, the role of historical trauma so powerfully.
The 1926 Bohemia spillway incident.
Yes, where marginalized communities, primarily African-American oyster fishermen and trappers, were allegedly misled and ultimately forced off valuable, potentially oil-rich land under the justification of creating a flood relief spillway. The sources describe this event as creating profound distrust between these communities and government agencies, a distrust that persists generations later.
So this isn't just history. It's an active constraint now.
It operates as a powerful contemporary constraint. The memory of that betrayal, passed down through families and communities, acts like a form of historical sediment. It actively undermines the legitimacy and viability of current coastal restoration efforts proposed by state and federal agencies, even if those projects are technically sound and genuinely intended to help. The historical context of injustice creates a barrier to present-day cooperation.
Wow. So the profound comparative insight here is this shift. Historically, you might read the river's past context in its physical layers, old channels, sediment deposits. Today, we are often more profoundly constrained by invisible legal, infrastructural, and traumatic path dependencies.
The decisions, the mistakes, and crucially, the injustices of the past govern our present possibilities, sometimes even more powerfully than present-day environmental factors like climate change itself. That historical context is not just background, it's an active force.
We inherit the consequences, whether we acknowledge them or not.
We absolutely do. Contextuality means history is never really over.
Okay, that leads us to the seventh dimension, non-finality. This sounds like it acknowledges the limits of our knowledge. It suggests that no theory, no understanding, no plan can ever be complete or permanently fixed. Knowledge is always provisional, always evolving.
Exactly. It's a call for epistemic humility, really. Recognizing that the world, especially complex systems like rivers, is constantly changing and inherently unpredictable to some degree. Our understanding will always be partial and subject to revision.
Historically, how did societies deal with this? The study suggests a kind of balance between adaptation and stability.
Yeah, it seems historical knowledge systems often manage this tension. On the one hand, you had continuous adaptation based on experience. Explorers were constantly updating geographical knowledge, correcting maps of waterfalls, remapping shifting river channels as they encountered them. Practical knowledge had to adapt to changing realities.
But there was also a core of stability.
Yes, particularly in many indigenous knowledge systems. Think back to the Navajo example. While practical farming techniques might adapt year to year based on rainfall, the core sacred songs and stories detailing the relationship with the land and water were deliberately preserved, sometimes using archaic language, to ensure the foundational cultural and spiritual understanding remains stable across generations. It was a selective stability anchoring the adaptive practices.
Okay, a balance. But in the contemporary era, non-finality isn't about balance anymore. It feels more like a relentless mandate for constant change and revision.
That's a very good way to put it. Continuous technological monitoring, coupled with the accelerating pace of environmental change, which we discussed under Becoming, forces us into a state of almost endless revision. Everything seems unstable now. The climate baseline is shifting, river flows are becoming less predictable, historical legal baselines like the Colorado Compact are proving inadequate, ecosystems are transforming rapidly.
And our tools reflect this need for constant updates.
Absolutely. We use those GRACE satellites to get near real-time data on global water mass changes. We use metagenomics to track shifts in microbial biodiversity. This fire hose of data constantly reveals new complexities and changes, demanding updated models and forecasts.
And policy has to try and keep up.
Policy is forced into reactive, often experimental, adaptation. Consider some of the examples mentioned. The deliberate pulse flow experiment, known as Minute 319, in the Colorado River Basin. That was a specific temporary release of water designed to reach the delta in Mexico, explicitly to test how the ecosystem might respond, to learn something in the face of uncertainty.
An experiment, basically.
A large-scale management experiment. Or think about the truly radical legal innovation of granting the Wanganui River legal personhood. That's a fundamental rethinking of the legal framework itself, driven by the recognition that the old models weren't working and something new was needed to deal with its complex reality.
The sheer velocity of change seems overwhelming. So this transformation is from that historical model of selective stability within adaptation to a modern condition of mandated continuous revision across the board.
Which creates what the study aptly labels epistemic anxiety, a state of knowing that nothing is truly stable anymore. Not the river's flow, not the ecological baseline, not the legal frameworks, and certainly not the global climate systems that ultimately sustain the rivers. We are constantly managing change that often accelerates faster than our ability to fully understand, predict, or adapt institutionally.
And that profound uncertainty has huge policy implications, right? If the historical baseline for normal flow is constantly changing due to climate change, how do you even set meaningful long-term water allocations? How do you define achievable restoration goals for an ecosystem that might be heading towards a completely novel state?
Exactly. Non-finality means we have to accept a degree of permanent provisionality in how we understand and manage these systems. Certainty is an illusion. Adaptive management, learning by doing, becomes essential, but also incredibly challenging politically and socially.
We have to plan for a future we can't fully predict.
That's the essence of navigating non-finality in the Anthropocene.
Okay, now we're entering the final stretch, part 3, ethics and synthesis. This brings together the implications of the previous dimensions, focusing on how we should act and how we can synthesize all these complex insights. We start with Dimension 8, ethical praxis.
Yes, and this one is crucial because it connects knowing directly to doing. Ethical praxis is the GWT concept, that how we describe the world, the narratives we tell, the frameworks we use, actively shapes how we live in it and act upon it. Our descriptions are performative. They help create the reality they describe.
So the stories we tell about rivers directly shape our policies and ultimately their ecological outcomes.
Absolutely. Think historically again. The narratives used were often quite performatively honest about their goals, whether we agree with those goals now or not.
For better or worse, you said.
For better or worse, consider the dominant 19th century narrative, particularly in the U.S., of the Amazon rainforest as this vast, untapped wilderness replete with witches, just waiting for civilization to exploit it.
The green hell or green treasure chest idea.
Yeah. Exactly. That narrative directly drove U.S. foreign policy demanding free navigation on the Amazon River, and it explicitly justified the goal, or at least the expectation, that Western-style development would inevitably, and perhaps rightly, replace indigenous cultures and land uses. The narrative of resource conquest directly performed and enabled the practice of conquest.
But narratives could also work the other way, towards
Yeah.
preservation.
Yes. The study contrasts that with the narrative surrounding Yellowstone in the 1870s. Early explorers and promoters described it not just as resource-rich, but as a place of unique, almost sublime natural beauty, a stupendous climax of wonders.
Language of awe and wonder.
Language of awe and wonder. And that powerful, ethically charged narrative led directly, quite quickly, to political action. Designating Yellowstone as the world's first national park in 1872, explicitly preserving it against private speculation and development. The ethical description of wonder performed the practice of preservation.
So fast forward to the contemporary era. What kind of narratives are shaping ethical praxis now? The study mentions a shift towards more relational rhetoric.
We definitely see that globally. There's much more talk now about rivers as partners, as living entities, as relatives, especially influenced by resurgent indigenous voices and environmental ethics. The narrative framework that enabled the Wanganui River's legal personhood in New Zealand is a prime example.
How so?
It explicitly shifts the dominant description of the river away from being mere property or resource towards understanding it as Te Awa Tupua, a living, indivisible ancestor. This moral reframing demands a different ethical practice, one based on respect, guardianship, and acting in the river's best interests. The narrative forces a change in ethics.
But this is where the tension comes in, right? The gap between rhetoric and reality.
Exactly. The failure of ethical praxis is still painfully evident in many places. Look at the Ganges again. You have the deeply embedded, powerful narrative of purity of the river as a sacred entity that cannot truly be polluted.
Which we discussed under pluralism.
Right. But that narrative, however spiritually significant, actively hinders the ethical practice required for effective pollution management. It makes it harder to implement the actions needed to address the very real material pollution that causes immense human suffering and ecological damage. The ethical description, sacred purity, clashes violently with the practical ethics needed for public health and environmental stewardship.
So the comparative insight here is really about this tension, this lag between our aspirational narratives and our actual implementation.
Precisely. We are increasingly adopting narratives of relationship, of interdependence, of rivers as living beings. You hear it in policy documents, in corporate sustainability reports, and environmental advocacy, but we struggle mightily to dismantle the deeply entrenched physical infrastructure, the economic incentives, and the legal frameworks that operationally still treat rivers primarily as resource pools to be exploited or conduits for waste.
Our contemporary ethical crisis, then, is defined by this gap, this hypocrisy sometimes, between what we say rivers are and what our actions show we believe they are.
It's a crisis of coherence between our stated values and our lived practices. Ethical praxis demands we close that gap.
That leads us perfectly into the ninth and final dimension of the general world theory framework as applied to rivers. Transversality. This sounds like it's about bringing everything together.
It is. Transversality is the idea that the most profound insights, the most effective solutions, don't usually arise from within a single disciplinary silo, but emerge at the intersections, the transversal connections between multiple domains of knowledge and practice, hydrology, culture, economics, spirituality, governance, ecology, all of them.
Seeing across the boundaries.
Seeing across and connecting through the boundaries. Historically, this kind of integration wasn't necessarily a conscious intellectual choice. It often happened out of sheer practical necessity for collective survival.
Like ancient Egypt again.
Early Egyptian irrigation is a fantastic example of implicit transversality. To manage the Nile effectively required integrating deep geological knowledge, knowing where to quarry the hard granite near Aswan for monumental construction and maybe early water control structures. It required sophisticated hydrological understanding of the flood dynamics, sediment deposition, and drainage. And it absolutely required complex political and social organization, often involving hierarchical control and forced labor, the corvée, to build and maintain the canals and basins.
You couldn't succeed as a ruler without mastering all those domains.
You couldn't sustain the civilization without integrating them. The river itself demanded that integration. Success depended on connecting insights across geology, hydrology, engineering, agriculture, religion, and political power.
Okay, so integration was born of necessity. Today, we seem to consciously pursue integration. We talk about interdisciplinarity all the time. We set up institutions specifically for it.
We do. We have numerous examples of institutionalized interdisciplinarity. Think of bodies like the International Commission for the Protection of the Danube River, ICPDR. It brings together scientific experts, policymakers, and stakeholders from 14 different countries along the Danube.
Trying to manage the river basin collaboratively.
Exactly. Or the Mekong River Commission, MRC, which provides frameworks for dialogue and data sharing among Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam, trying to balance hydropower development, fisheries, agriculture, and ecological health in that incredibly complex basin. These are explicit attempts to foster transversality.
But there's a but coming, isn't there?
There's a profound irony here. We have vastly more sophisticated tools for integration today, complex computational models that can link hydrology and economics, international legal frameworks, remote sensing data from satellites, shared databases, all things historical societies lacked.
Yet we struggle.
Yet we often struggle more than historical societies did to achieve truly holistic, integrated, and effective management. Why? The study suggests it's because the very knowledge systems we rely on are academic disciplines, with their specific jargons, methodologies, and reward structures, and our bureaucratic government agencies with their narrowly defined mandates and budgets actively resist genuine integration.
The silos are too strong.
The silos are incredibly strong. Hydrologists prioritize accurate flow measurements. Economists focus on cost-benefit analysis and resource allocation efficiency. Cultural experts emphasize preserving heritage and meaning. Ecologists focus on biodiversity metrics. They often speak different conceptual languages, value different kinds of evidence, and operate under different metrics of success.
So putting them in the same room isn't enough.
It's necessary, but not sufficient. True transversality requires more than just multidisciplinary teams. It requires forcing those different perspectives to grapple with each other, to find common ground, perhaps even to develop a shared ethical and relational language that can somehow value water flow, cultural significance, economic benefit, and ecological health simultaneously, rather than trading them off against each other.
So the deepest insights, the most effective and just solutions, only really appear at those messy, difficult seams between our specialized fields of knowledge.
That's where the breakthroughs happen, according to the principle of transversality. It's about actively cultivating those cross-domain connections, even when it's uncomfortable or challenges disciplinary assumptions. So that brings us towards the synthesis of this whole deep dive, looking across all 9 dimensions of general world theory as illuminated by the study of rivers. And when you pull back and look at the pattern across interdependence, pluralism, becoming, relational knowing, entanglement, contextuality, non-finality, ethical praxis, and transversality, a master narrative emerges quite clearly.
And what is that core narrative?
The study argues compellingly that humanity, particularly in the modern industrial era, has fundamentally shifted its relationship with rivers. We moved from a state of immersed participation, literally being in the river's life, adapting to its rhythms, possessing embodied knowledge, to a state of mediated management.
Existing beside the river.
Existing beside it, often distanced from it, trying to understand and control it through abstract models, technological sensors, and complex legal or bureaucratic structures, from participation to mediation, from integration to separation.
And this fundamental shift, this distancing, generates that devastating paradox we keep circling back to.
It really does. On the one hand, we possess utterly unprecedented scientific understanding of rivers. We know more about them as complex, interdependent, dynamic systems than ever before in human history. We can model their flows, analyze their chemistry, map their genetic diversity. Yet this very explosion of knowledge seems to have coincided with, and perhaps even enabled us to degrade these systems more severely and rapidly than ever before, leading directly to crises like the Colorado River's potential collapse, the drowning of the Mississippi Delta, the pollution of the Ganges, ecological catastrophes on a scale that historical societies, with their supposedly primitive technologies, rarely achieved.
So the study's core finding, the unavoidable conclusion, is therefore what?
It's inescapable. This crisis is fundamentally not a failure of scientific knowledge. We have the knowledge, or at least vast amounts of it. It is, rather, a profound failure of relationship.
Failure of relationship.
We know what rivers are, in scientific sense, hydrological systems, ecological corridors, but we've largely forgotten or institutionally ignored what rivers mean in a relational sense. What the Maori know when they speak of Te Awa Tupua, what the Navajo knew about male and female water, what the ancient Egyptians knew when they built their entire civilization around the rhythms of the flood. We've lost the connection, the respect, the reciprocity.
So the path forward, according to this research and the GWT framework, isn't just about better science or more technology, is it?
No, it requires something deeper, what the study might implicitly call relational restoration. This means rebuilding not just the physical ecosystems, replanting mangroves, removing dams where appropriate, but rebuilding our capacity for relationship with these living systems. Moving from a mindset of extraction and control to one of genuine participation and co-becoming.
And practically, what does that look like?
Well, based on the dimensions we've discussed, it means serious institutional innovation to accommodate multiple valid truths honoring pluralism, maybe through mechanisms like legal personhood or co-management frameworks that give real power to diverse stakeholders, especially indigenous communities.
It sounds like it also requires confronting the past.
Absolutely.
Okay.
It requires addressing historical accountability, really grappling with contextuality, confronting the legacies of past harms and injustices, like the Bohemia spillway example, as a necessary step towards rebuilding trust for future collaboration. You can't have a healthy relationship without addressing past wounds.
And valuing different kinds of knowledge.
Yes, embracing relational knowing. It means honoring and integrating the wisdom embedded in historical and indigenous approaches alongside scientific data. Accepting the river's invitation, conveyed through these diverse knowledge systems, to participate rather than merely manage.
The river, then, in its very being, embodying all these GWT dimensions, flow, change, connection, memory, it's essentially posing the ultimate ethical and practical challenge to humanity, isn't it?
It really is. It teaches us through its floods and its droughts, through its resilience and its vulnerability, what happens when relationships are honored and what happens when they are violated. Its state reflects our own state.
Which brings us, I think, to our final provocative thought for you, the listener, to take away and really mull over.
It's a stark comparison drawn from the study's insights. Reflect on this. Ancient Egyptian civilization sustained itself along the Nile for millennia. They did it through relatively simple adaptive practices like the shaduf, practices that worked with the river's natural cycle. They had no massive dams, no satellites, no complex computer models, yet they flourished and endured for an astonishingly long time.
Okay.
Now contrast that with contemporary civilization. With our vastly superior technical knowledge and engineering capacity, we have brought a river like the Colorado to the absolute brink of systemic collapse in less than a single century. Millennia of sustainability versus a century of depletion. Why?
That is quite the question.
It forces us to ask, what did they know or how did they relate that we have forgotten or chosen to ignore?
The ultimate question the study leaves us with, then, is whether we, individually and collectively, can finally accept the river's profound inherent invitation. An invitation to move beyond merely managing resources, beyond trying to impose control.
And towards actively, respectfully participating in a shared, living, dynamic system. Because the deepest conclusion of applying general world theory to rivers seems to be this. The river and the civilization it sustains are not separate entities at all. They are entangled, co-produced realities. They rise and fall together.
To save the river is, in the end, to finally recognize that interdependence and, in doing so, save ourselves.